Climax Corporation was one of the leading producers of European adult content up until the 1990s, and it's still somewhat well known today among admirers of classic explicit content. The company has an incredibly dark history though, and was actually the first to produce commercial films involving actual children. And what's more shocking is that this content was actually totally legal in Denmark at the time. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video centers around inappropriate content involving children and animals. Viewer discretion is advised. You can click the link in the description and become a Ko-fi member to watch an uncut version of this video, which features extra details that were unsuitable for this cut. Climax Corporation, we'll shorten it to CC, was founded in Denmark in 1967. At the time, hardcore adult content was actually illegal in this country and many others, including the US and the UK. Some magazines and films were able to get around this though by framing the content as art or educational content. For example, a documentary titled Censorship in Denmark, A New Approach was released in the US in 1970, and in addition to the inclusion of graphic scenes, it also featured reports from the trade fair, interviews, and vox pops from around Copenhagen. Although the films that the graphic scenes were taken from would be illegal to screen in American cinemas, Censorship in Denmark was a documentary about these films, not just the films themselves, so it wasn't technically illegal. Magazines weren't allowed to show actual uncensored contact between two people, but photos of naked women could be classed as art, as could realistic drawings of contact in some countries. Anyway, CC began releasing content in August 1967, with the first edition of their Climax magazine, which at the time was just called Climax. In an attempt to fool the police, the publisher was noted as Bengt Olsen, Stockholm, Sweden. This didn't end up working though, and their office was raided the same year they began publishing content, and police seized all their adult material. While quite shocking at the time, the magazine would be considered pretty tame compared to today's standards. But just a couple of years later, in July 1969, the year was quite fitting, I guess, Denmark lifted the ban on all explicit content. Producers like CC were now free to show just about anything in their magazines and films, introducing the public to a variety of concepts that were almost unheard of at the time outside of niche circles. CC quickly earned a reputation, and their magazines were regarded as some of the best quality not safe for work magazines in Europe, especially in the UK, where the sale of hardcore content was illegal until the year 2000. Prior to this, it wasn't uncommon to see relatively tame magazines in plastic packaging, with a Climax front cover on the outside, being sold in adult shops, as well as watered-down reproductions of CC titles. The world was CC's oyster now that all kinds of adult content had been legalized in Denmark, and this unrestricted freedom opened some extremely disturbing doors. In addition to all the categories that to most of us today don't seem that extreme, but were quite startling back then, CC began producing content featuring animals, particularly women having contact with animals. Shockingly, contact with animals was actually legal in Denmark until 2015, as long as the animal was unharmed. This law was very controversial, particularly among animal activists who believed it was difficult to prove that the animal had been harmed, and that the simple fact that an animal can't say no is harmful enough. Apparently, such activity was pretty common in Denmark. There would be live shows, clubs, and even animal brothels, and people would travel to Denmark to take part in it. In 2011, a report by the Danish Justice Ministry found that 17% of vets suspected an animal they treated had been involved in contact with a human. After the ban, people found guilty of the crime faced up to 1 year in prison for a first offence and 2 years for repeat offenders. This is ridiculous, to be honest. I'm a relatively non-judgmental person when it comes to people's interests and preferences in the bedroom, but I draw the line when there's a lack of consent, and obviously animals aren't able to consent. 1 to 2 years in prison really isn't that much of a deterrent, but I think in general laws relating to animal abuse are far too soft. Anyway, since production, distribution, and possession of adult content was legalized in Denmark in 1969, and human contact with animals was already illegal, of course companies like CC were going to capitalize on the fact that there are some very messed up people in the world, hence they began producing this content. It started out with a magazine series titled Animal Lover, which usually featured women and animals, and CC soon began producing films too. Many of these films featured a woman named Bodil Joensen, whose life story is equal parts tragic and sickening. Bodil was born near Copenhagen in September 1944 to a devout Christian mother and an absent military father. Her mother was very strict and physically abusive and would often whip her for next to nothing, such as if she saw Bodil hanging around with a boy. When Bodil was 12, she was walking home from school one day and was approached by a man she didn't know at the train station. Sources vary regarding what exactly happened next, but she either was essayed or was nearly essayed. When she got home and told her mother what happened, her mother beat her and blamed her for the incident. She recalled that she had never been punished as violently as this before. In retaliation, Bodil swore to her mother that when she grew up, she would have contact with boars. This horrified her mother, who was apparently so shocked that she thought Bodil was allied to the devil. Although she might not have meant it literally at the time, it was just the worst thing she could think of to say in that moment. Her promise would eventually begin to manifest. Bodil left home at 15 and found work on a farm, the landlord of which noted that she was passionate about animals and particularly entranced by the sight of them breeding. She later set up her own breeding farm and gained a reputation among farmers, who were surprised that a young woman could handle aggressive animals such as boars, though many women in the area resented her and spread gossip, mostly farmers' wives who didn't like the idea of their husbands working with a young single girl on farm business. This gossip and the refusal of farmers' wives to allow their husbands to work with Bodil played a big part in the deterioration of her business, and she soon found herself unable to make ends meet. At the age of 17, worried that she might have to give up her home and her animals, she turned to the adult entertainment industry to supplement her income. For a few years, she stuck to relatively vanilla content, but around 1969, she began appearing in photography and films involving animals. She started out working with Ole Egg, a cinematographer and director who in 1972 made Baudelaire, Denmark's first full-length hardcore feature film. Sometime after Bodil met Ole, she turned to one of his rivals, Climax Corporation. Throughout her career, she had contact with various animal species, and by 1972 had starred with animals in over 40 movies. Some of these were filmed consecutively, and she once reportedly filmed 4 movies in 4 hours. She became known worldwide as the Boar Girl after a number of live performances with boars and films that were shot with her own pigs at her farm, where she also had dogs, cats, rabbits, a guinea pig, a mare and a stallion, some of which she also had contact with. In 1972, she had a daughter and lived on the farm with her and her companion, who may have been a romantic partner or just a platonic friend, it's not clear. In addition to the income from her work with Olay and CC, she also earned money by allowing people to visit the farm and make private films with her animals. Some of these people would travel from different countries for the opportunity. Some of her few friends were interviewed at later dates and stated that she was easily exploited by almost anyone with a camera, and that no one really cared about knowing her, they just wanted the footage she could provide. When the Danish adult industry began focusing more on other categories, Bodil struggled to adapt and wasn't able to maintain her popularity in other areas. By 1980, she had physically and psychologically deteriorated significantly. Her debts were mounting, and the only work she could find was performing in small-scale live shows with her dog. She became an alcoholic, smoked around 100 cigarettes a day, and began comfort eating, resulting in her putting on quite a bit of weight. In an interview in 1980, she stated that the death of her dog had affected her significantly, in a time where she was already struggling. Quote, "Things went completely out of hand when Spot died. I started taking sedatives, but when someone referred to them as loony smarties, I threw them in the fireplace. Instead, I started drinking and eating excessively. I gained 30 kilos. Doesn't look well on something that was going downhill anyway. Spot was a real German Shepherd that I got from an animals hospital 10 years ago. She had been beaten. She never became anything but a little weak dog. I've never been able to talk to other girls. I've always been with men. Spot was my female friend. She understood what I said, was happy when I was happy, was sad when I was. When we were alone in the house without light and heat, we went to bed together, shared a biscuit, and then we talked until we fell asleep. Spot is the only living creature that has loved me for being just me. She didn't expect anything back. She soothed me when I was ill. I've experienced a lot with Lassie and like him a lot, but it'll never be the same as with Spot. Lassie has been unfaithful to me. He's an every girl's dog. Spot was mine, completely mine. That's why I had such a shock when she died and started drinking and eating myself fat in no time. I lived with my man for 10 years and my 8-year-old daughter. Still, I feel like the loneliest human being now that Spot is dead. In those days, I earned easy money in a tough line of work. I fell and fell. When will I reach the bottom? I often ask myself these days. While it doesn't condone her inappropriate contact with animals, it's sad to think that so many humans had failed her that she was only able to truly relate to a dog, specifically a dog who had been beaten and abandoned. It sounds like most of the people she'd met in her life had either abused or exploited her, and the dog was the only one who had loved her unconditionally. In 1981, after a change in laws regarding animal welfare, Bodil's farm was raided due to her neglecting the animals. Apparently they were kept in 1.5 meters of excrement, and police found the rotting carcass of a pig, half eaten by the other pigs. She was charged with animal abuse and severe neglect and was sentenced to 30 days in jail. The animals were euthanized, and Bodil, already an alcoholic at this point, became even more depressed, feeling that she had nothing left. Even her partner and her daughter weren't enough. All she wanted was her animals. She soon began selling herself on the street for alcohol and stated in her final interview, quote, "In my position, it is hard to turn down anything, no matter how disgusting. For me, staying alive in the hooking business is hell." By 1985, she was drinking 1.5 bottles of alcohol a day and addicted to out-of-date tranquilizers, and in January that year, at the age of just 40, she died from cirrhosis. Despite the decline of Bodil's fame in Denmark in the late 1970s, some parts of the world were only just being exposed to her. Various scenes featuring explicit activity with animals, mostly starring Bodil and produced by Climax Corporation, were compiled into an underground film known unofficially as Animal Farm, and this film was smuggled into Britain in the early 1980s. The VCR industry boomed in the 1980s, and by the end of the decade, around 60% of British homes owned a VCR. The thought of not being restricted by limited content on rigid time schedules was naturally very appealing. Among various genres of videos that were sought after during this time, one of the more popular was adult content. In fact, it's estimated that up to 25% of videotapes on the market were not safe for work. These hardcore films were illegal though, and if you were found to have produced or distributed them, you'd be facing jail time. People would smuggle these films from other countries, using increasingly creative methods to avoid being caught. One method included taking apart the VHS and hiding the spool in a whiskey box. Once smugglers made it back to England, they'd create copies of the tapes and sell them to adult shops, where the copies would be sold for around £70 to £80 each. It was quite a profitable business if you were willing to take the risk. Animal Farm was one of the most notorious films of this nature. People have compared it to the announcement of the death of JFK, in that everyone can remember where they were when they first watched the film. Its popularity doesn't necessarily mean that people actually enjoyed it though. In fact, most people who have since described it seem to be horrified by it. It seems that people would put it on at parties or play it to their unsuspecting friends as a prank or to get a reaction out of them. Although watching it was kind of seen as some bizarre rite of passage, there was actually no single Animal Farm. There were about 4 different versions, all of which were known by the same name. Bodil was the main star in all of them, and they'd all been originally produced by Climax Corporation. It sounds like some of the scenes featured in all the versions, but there were some clips that only featured in 1 or 2. CC decided to capitalise on the boom of at-home VCRs and recycled a lot of their content from the 1970s that had previously only been shown in cinemas, hence the creation of Animal Farm. Content with animals wasn't the only disturbing category of adult material that was produced by CC though, and here's where it gets so much worse. When I said that Denmark had legalised all kinds of explicit content, unfortunately that also included content featuring children. CC became the first company to produce commercial CP, and from 1969 to 1979, it was responsible for the relatively large-scale distribution of such content. Between 1971 and 1979, it produced at least 36 10-minute films for its Lolita series, featuring young girls, mainly with men, but sometimes with women or other children. The majority of these girls were under the age of 11, some were younger than 7. There were various spin-off magazines that included photos of children nude and engaging in inappropriate activities too. How exactly this content was produced is a little hard to determine. From what I gather, the actual production of CP was illegal in Denmark, but distribution and possession was legal. The age of consent in Denmark was and still is 15, so it would have been legal to produce content featuring 15-year-olds, even though that would have been classed as CP in many other countries. But CC featured girls mainly aged between 7 and 11 years, some even younger, so I don't know if they were breaking the law and producing the content in Denmark, or if they were producing it in countries that had a lower age of consent and only distributing it in Denmark. But as far as I'm aware, no countries have, or had at that time, an age of consent as low as 7 or even younger, so laws were being broken somewhere. It's not that CP specifically was legalised in Denmark. All types of adult content was legalised, without any restrictions, So I guess politicians at the time didn't exactly foresee that content like CP would end up becoming widespread, because laws prevented it from being produced in the country in the first place. Regardless, apparently many Danish people and politicians believed that CP was a victimless activity, and that if people had access to it, they'd be less likely to assault a child. So while the consequences of legalizing all types of content may not have been accurately predicted in the first place, it doesn't sound like they saw a valid enough reason to go to the effort of banning CP for many years. One might assume that there wasn't enough backlash because the general public weren't really exposed to it, that perhaps it was only really known about within certain groups, but no, it was rampant. The topic was discussed on TV, and apparently you could go into most adult stores and find magazines featuring children on the shelves. There were certain stores that specifically advertised that they specialised in CP. Some had machines where you could put a coin in and watch a few minutes of uncensored film featuring preschool children. Although these films were illegal in other parts of the world, they still made their way to countries like the US and were available in some adult stores, particularly in states like Philadelphia. The source of this material in the US was hard to uncover. Shop assistants would claim they didn't know who their bosses were. Their bosses would claim they didn't know who their distributors were, and their distributors would claim that they didn't know who the producers were. It was a sordid chain of secrecy that facilitated the abuse of children. Although many of these films were likely produced, or at least originated, in other countries like Denmark, or countries in Asia or India, as some of them featured Asian and Indian children, plenty were being produced in the US. When police would track down the victims in these films, they found that many of their parents had allowed them to be used in the production of such content. Larry Parish, an assistant attorney who has prosecuted a number of CP cases, said, quote, "I know of a situation where the mother was interviewed and she said she just charged the people who were doing the film $25 and didn't see why anyone was upset. The little girl didn't mind it." A photographer in the 1970s who took photos of nude children as young as 3 for his magazine, Nudist Muppets, but claimed they were not meant to be viewed how they obviously were viewed, stated that he paid the parents of the children with gifts or cash at $10 an hour. He disputed accusations against him that he was exploiting the children solely with the fact that he got their parents' permission and they didn't seem to mind. Quote, "The children who pose for my magazine pose with parental consent. I do not take children off the street with a candy bar. I don't think I've exploited them. How can being honest be exploiting them? I mean, I asked the kids if they wanted to take the pictures." One mother whose daughter had been photographed for the magazine defended her decision, stating that she didn't make society sick, and if someone gets off at looking at a child posing, she'd rather see them get off looking at her daughter posing than go out and essay someone. I'm honestly lost for words at all this. Some parents would produce this content themselves. For example, a New York housewife made a 9-minute movie with her 10-year-old daughter and 9-year-old son. She sold 60 copies of it for $30 each, before the film reportedly made its way into the hands of larger distributors who had the means to reach a wider audience. There were reportedly several organised groups in the US who would campaign for the age of consent to be scrapped, claiming that children having contact with adults was necessary for their well-being, and of course that there was nothing wrong with CP. Although the distribution of explicit content in general was illegal at this time in the US, there were actually no laws that specifically addressed CP, so while by default it was illegal, you wouldn't be punished more harshly for distributing content featuring children than you would for content featuring consenting adults. The laws around this time were a little hard to understand, so please correct me in the comments if I get anything wrong here, but as I understand it, in the same way that censorship in Denmark, the documentary I mentioned earlier, was able to circumvent US laws related to explicit content because it was a documentary, producers of mild, for lack of a better word, CP, were able to circumvent laws by passing their content off as art, hence the existence of magazines like Nudist Moppets. It sounds like the photographer was only ever indicted on charges of contributing to the delinquency of minors. After the laws regarding possession of adult content were relaxed in the US, only 2 states had laws that prohibited the use of children in the production or distribution of explicit material until 1977, when the production and dissemination was banned in all states. According to Roger Young, the FBI's former lead obscenity investigator, when I began working CP cases early in 1977, there were no CP laws. We used obscenity laws to prosecute CP. In 1978, Congress enacted a law that prohibited the production of CP without proof of obscenity, but the law was limited to material produced for pecuniary profit. It wasn't until after 1982, when the Supreme Court held that CP could be prosecuted without proof of obscenity, that Congress enacted laws aimed at non-commercial production and distribution of CP. Even after the laws changed in 1977, people found ways around it. Eric Cross, who was born in England but lived in Florida, took 2 girls aged 10 and 11 on holiday with their parents' permission. At the hotel, he took several hundred nude photos of them before returning them to their parents. He then took the photos to Europe to be published and imported them back into the US, a method that became very common among US producers. Apparently, a lot of this material can still be found online now, and until at least 2007 was thought to form a significant part of the CP available at the time. It's a bizarre and of course horrifying concept to think about, really, because the only difference between Denmark and the US and other countries is that Denmark had legalized all explicit content in 1969, whereas all explicit content was illegal in other countries in 1969. In the eyes of the law, content involving children was no better or worse than content involving adults in both Denmark and the US. It's shocking to me because I don't know if I'm being naive here, but I kind of just assumed that crimes relating to CP had become much more prevalent and that it was much easier to access since the internet became widely used. I didn't realise that what I guess you could describe as a loophole meant that you could literally just wander into an adult store in the US and view CP with no consequences, depending on the specific type. What's even more horrifying is that the production, distribution, and possession of CP is still 100% legal to this day in a handful of countries, including the Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, Libya, Somalia, Dominica, and St. Lucia. Possession is legal in quite a few more countries, including Angola, the Gambia, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Russia, Cuba, and Uruguay. This is definitely one of the worst topics I've covered on this channel. It's honestly shocking to think that CP was not only legal in Denmark, but commercially distributed. I don't know if it's a generational thing or if opinions have changed over time, but there seemed to be nowhere near as much outrage at any of this than there would be if it happened today. I'm sure a lot of people did oppose it, but I'm surprised at how many seemed to be neutral on it, or even condoned it, and assumed that it would prevent paedophiles from actually harming children, ignoring the fact that children were harmed in the first place in the production of such content. We assume that paedophiles are a tiny minority of the population, but anytime I cover topics related to CP, it always makes me wonder if there are way more than we'd like to think, and that's a terrifying possibility. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments, plus any other topics you'd like me to cover in a future video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in a new video.